This is Julie Pearson, Little Thunder, with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Today is January 24th, 2019, and I'm interviewing Dr. Henrietta Mann, a professor emeritus at Montana State University and a longtime trailblazer in Native education. We're here in Weatherford, Oklahoma. Dr. Mann, you're the founding president of the former Cheyenne Arapaho College, professor emeritus, as I mentioned, a recipient of so many awards and honors. We probably won't get to mention them all, but we'll try to hit some highlights. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
That is perfectly my privilege.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Clinton, Oklahoma in 1934, but I grew up in Hammond, Oklahoma in the Red Moon community. And it was a phenomenal time to be born into this world. It was the time of the Dust Bowls. It was when Bonnie and Clyde were killed. It was shortly. It was shortly thereafter that the Dion quintuplets were born, and it was a wonderful world for me. Of course, I did not know about the Dust Bowls, but I was totally engrossed by love because my great grandmother was still alive. So it was a very opportune time for me to have come to live on this earth.
So, talk a bit about your family, if you would, your folks, your grandmother or grandfather, whoever was in that unit, and brothers or sisters, if you have them.
We lived in a 3-room home in a curve of the Ouachita River, just downstream from the place where the Ouachita Massacre had occurred. And there were 4 generations that lived in that 3-room house. I imagine it was a little crowded, but we didn't mind that. I mean, there was a certain closeness. There was my great grandmother, White Buffalo Woman, who was still alive at that point in time. My grandfather, who was a widower, and he had 2 younger daughters that also lived there. His name was Spotted Horse. His 2 daughters were, the youngest one was Lucille, Mamie Lucille, and her name was Night Walking Woman. Then his older daughter was Flying Woman. And then, of course, also living there was his oldest granddaughter, Miriam Mann, twins, and her name was Cricket Nose Woman. She was named for my grandfather's sister, who was also a Miriam, as well as Wakiesa, Crooked Nose Woman. Then there were my parents, the Henry Mann. And what is notable about my father, whose name was Mahilnivikus, or Vikus Mahilnif, means holy bird, or bird holy, until he went to Europe and fought in the Second World War. And when he came home, there was a great big celebration in which his name was officially changed in the Cheyenne way. I can remember him riding around the arena on a horse, a beautiful horse, and a phenomenal pair of full-beaded moccasins that my mother had made for him. And there was a teepee standing there that she had also made, and his name was changed from Holy Bird to Horse Road. And he had been born in that part of the state in which I was born. Then there's my mother. Her name is Day Woman Ishieva. Her last name was Wolf Time. And she was from the Clinton area, around what was called Big J Crossing. and that was where she grew up. But my parents met at Concho, and then there was me, and of course, my Aunt Miriam's husband also lived there with us. I've lost track of how many of us lived in that 3-room house, but all I can remember is that the kitchen dining area was also a bedroom. There was a bed off in one corner, and that was where my great grandmother stayed. And there were beds all over the place. We didn't have couches. You sat on a bed when you came to visit. There were chairs, and it was a very close knit family that I can remember. It was full of love. It was a very happy place for me. And then my father, who learned well how to be a farmer and an agriculturist at Concho Indian School, that Bureau of Indian Affairs school, decided to go into farming. And so my mother and father uh, got financing, I believe, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and moved onto some land that they I guess farmed from, that was tribal land, and moved to a big, huge 2-story home that, from what I understand, once belonged to the Indian agent. But we moved in there, and there were 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bedroom downstairs, a living room with living room furniture, a kitchen, dining room combined with where my mother cooked, and then there was a little room off to the side of it, and I don't really know what that was except a walk-in pantry, which became my classroom. My father put up a blackboard. He got the blackboard from the now unoccupied, unused building called Red Moon School, which was just down the road east from us, not even a half a mile. And I had my own little schoolroom in there, a blackboard with a desk that he also confiscated from the abandoned school that once educated the young people from that area in the early reservation days, when we still had a reservation. And I had the desk, and there were days where one of my cousins would come over and play teacher, and I learned to count to 100. I learned my colors. Well before I went to school. It was, and she would go off to school, and then whenever she came to visit, would say, "This is what I learned in school. What these are called vowels, and these are called consonants. And let's see, let's hear you count to 100." So I had my own private teacher. Her name is Joyce Standing Water, Heap of Birds. Her father and my father were first cousins. Her grandmother, whom I mentioned as Crooked Nose Woman, Miriam Crooked Nose Woman Man Standing Water, was the sister to my grandfather, Spotted Horse. And they just lived across the Ouachita River and up the hill from us. But it was quite a distance for her to come to visit with me at the big house in which we now live, so that my father could farm and grow wheat and cotton, and my mother had her garden, and she was a phenomenal cook and housekeeper. They learned well at Concho, but they also, I think, grew up, or at least my mother did, in an atmosphere, because her mother had passed away when she was a teenager, I believe, and she had never had any models for parenting, and that just seems to be so common for many of our American Indian students that were educated in boarding schools, the BIA boarding schools. But she was a phenomenal cook, housekeeper, kept me clean, kept me fed. But I was just there. I got a lot of love from my father and my grandfather and other family members, but it was just something that had influenced her. She took very good care of me. She was a phenomenal beadworker, and I was born left-handed, and she'd try to teach me to bead, and I'd go backwards, and she'd say, "You don't bead in that direction." I'm sorry, and I try to go the direction that we're supposed to go, and I think in utter exasperation, she'd say, "What were you wanting to, what colors, what design were you wanting? I'll finish it for you, but you can go and get one of your books and sit over in the corner and read." So my mother gave to me that great gift of reading that I continue to enjoy in today, and I will forever be thankful of that. And she'd tell me, she said, "You can go any place if you read books. You can visit many places. You can learn about many people. So it's something that you have to learn to do anyway." And so my beadwork would get finished and I'd read my books, and that was the way it worked. And I have never been able uh, to bead, to crochet, to knit. I learned to embroider. Uh, I think I'm not the stereotype of what the Bureau of Indian Affairs used to say. Indians are good with their hands. Indians are good with their hands, with the inference that we're not good with our minds. I don't fit that stereotype. I was not good with my hands, and I had a love of learning that just naturally led into the field of education for myself and then for others that I taught for some 45 years or so.
That's just such a wonderful, yeah, explanation of how you chose your path. Sort of, it was all happening in those early years. And it
Mhm.
was your father's idea to get the chalkboard, or was it? Did you ask for it and the desk?
I think I asked for it. I was an only child
Mhm.
for a long time. I did have one brother, one biological brother, but unfortunately he passed away at about in his early 30s. He attended Chilocco Indian School, had gone out on relocation with my mother and father when they went to Los Angeles. And his life, unfortunately, was not as settled as mine was, surrounded by many people, well, surrounded by a family of love. And unfortunately, he died as a result of alcohol. And so I have no siblings other than that, but I do have many siblings. My cousins who are my brothers and sisters, and but I had one, and he was just everything that a sibling could be to me, and I miss him. He never married, never had any children, and he was also a Henry. He was Henry Mann Jr. My father was Henry Mann Sr., and my mother's English name was Lenora Wolfton, uh, known as Imogene. I don't know why they come up with those names, except the Bureau of Indian Affairs always had other names, and she'd say, "And my office name is." In this case, her office name was Lenora, but most people called her Imogene Wolfton. And she didn't have far to move when she and my father married, just from Clinton to Hammond. What is it, about 30 miles or so? But it just as well had been on the moon. And then when she and my father went out on relocation to Los Angeles, my father didn't like the urban sprawl, but she did. And she begged me many years later to bury her there. And it was just inconceivable to me. But she cried so many times. I never want to go back to Oklahoma. I have been totally happy here in Los Angeles, and I want to be buried here. And that went on for several years. And so finally, I said, "How do I convince my mother that I will bury her out here? It is her last wish, not my wish for her." And so I can remember the day that I went out and bought her a burial plot in Bell Gardens, California. And that's where she rests now. And so she was happy after that. Strange things, strange thinking for some people would say, to me, you please a parent
Mhm.
and you do what they want. And so, but she loved her relocation days, and my father didn't, and he came back home and lived here in Clinton until it was his turn to walk up that Milky Way, beyond the Milky Way, to that encampment in the stars. My mother was a very strong Christian, the influence of the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school, so much in fact that she became an evangelist of the Foursquare Gospel Church, and she took Merle Big Medicine as her daughter. And they were all living in Los Angeles. There was that Cheyenne community there, and so Merle is my sister in that regard. So I do have a sibling, and she's a wonderful sibling. You know, she and my mother just spend many happy times together, living where they wanted to live. But of course, Merle eventually moved back home.
Right.
My mother didn't, but by that time she had walked. She had walked away from us.
So you never went to California, though?
No, relocation was that dreaded policy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I believe their thinking was relocate all Indians to the city and let them get lost there, and that's a way of solving the so-called Indian problem. So my parents went on a train and to Los Angeles, but I didn't go because by that time I had graduated from high school at Hammond High School.
Okay.
I went to high school in Colony for 2 years after my father went to World War II and came home. He came home quite a wanderer, and so we moved a lot. And so he started farming in Colony, and so I went to high school 2 years there, and then he went into the city to try to find a job. Farming no longer held the same attraction for him, or it didn't help him provide for the family. So he went to work in Oklahoma City. So of course we went. There were the four of us that went, and I didn't like it in Oklahoma City. I went to Central High School for a semester, and culturally, my aunt Miriam carried out her responsibilities of sort of being responsible for her brother's child, which was me. And so I went back to live with her and her family in Hammond and graduated from Hammond High School in 1951. And then I came to college here at Southwestern Oklahoma State University.
Just to backtrack a minute, what were your experiences in public school? And I realize we're talking about some different places up until college.
I think the pattern was about the same regardless of where I went to school, even when I went as a child, having learned all of my numbers, my vowels, my consonants, my colors. I certainly was ahead of many of the students in that first grade class, but I had Anglo teachers, and they would, like they did for the rest of the Indian students from the Indian camp, which was northwest of Hammond, we never got called on. We just sort of sat silently in class. And that really was me. You never believe I was such a silent person because, in many ways, I become very verbal. At least I do a lot of public speaking, but I'm very content to just sit back and listen to people when they talk. And so that was something that had been ingrained in me as a child, that you listen. Uh, and so went through high school and got to high school. The teachers never ever called on me or involved me as a member of that particular class. And it was always so funny whenever I took an exam of some kind or a test of some kind and I scored higher than everybody else in class or close to the top. And then there was that sudden notice, oh, who is this Henrietta Mann? And Mann is my maiden name. I married a white man and my children are all white men's. And so uh, then I began to get attention that way, and I didn't like that either, because then it meant that I had to speak in front of the class. I wanted, it was always ingrained in me to be very humble, and to just stay in the background. So I really reverted to that. I would go and sit in the back of the room in the corner, as far away as I felt I could get from the teacher's eye, because even though I was ignored, as the Indian children usually were, I really understood what was going on, and some teachers never seemed to feel that we had the, as Cheyenne children in this case, Arapaho too in colony, that we had the same abilities as everybody else to think, to perform, to learn, to laugh, to cry, to just be human in every dimension. And that went on, I would say, clear through college, probably clear through my Doctor of Philosophy work at the University of New Mexico. I was just always that brown skinned student that, out of respect, a lot of it was respect, but I, I never volunteered much to speak in class, but when I was called upon, could verbalize myself pretty well. And so
So no
I
special, really no guidance necessarily at Southwestern when you went to college,
no,
or helpful professors.
no, there weren't. In fact, I believe I was the only Indian student on the campus of Southwestern Oklahoma State University back in 1951 to 1954. There would be other American Indians from the state that would come to Southwestern for summer school, but they never stayed the regular academic year, and they must have preceded me, because there were a lot of Comanches, Kiowas, and some Cheyennes, and it was just a pattern that was so ingrained in me that I, I, I was just accustomed to it, or just expected it to be the case. And so it was just so funny when I became a teacher, that it was so different for, for me. Uh, but it was a usual treatment of American Indians that was alive in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Unfortunate discrimination and racism in Oklahoma and throughout the country. I don't know that we've ever really overcome that. I don't think we have, just in terms of Martin Luther King's birthday celebration the other day, that I thought he gave his life for to rid this country of discrimination, but it's still here, very much here. And so that was why I decided wanted to be a teacher, because I wanted the younger children to know how valued that they really are, and that someone could recognize the knowledge that they carried with them, much of it traditional knowledge in terms of what they were taught at home, and that they had the ability to succeed and fail just as anybody else did. I devoted my life to teaching. I decided that I was going to be a teacher when I went to school in Hammond at about age. I went to school at 5 years of age. And maybe it was in the second or third grade when all of the Indian students were called out into the hall, me among them. Of course, I sat in the back. We were all taken out in the hall, and it was strange to me for all of us to be singled out, to be pulled out of class. And when I got out there, there was public health nurses, there were some teachers, there were, I don't know, churchwomen, I don't know. It seemed like it was a whole world, who were each of them looking in the heads of Indian children, looking for lice. I don't know if there had been a lice epidemic or not, but if there were, it certainly was not confined just to Indian students. And I was thrust in, and fortunately that day I didn't have any lice, although I had been carry a carrier if I went to visit some of my girlfriends, or you pick them up when you have long hair. And that day I didn't have any. And so I got on the bus, and it was about a 2 mile ride to my bus stop. And that entire ride was 1 2 taunts of dirty Indian, lousy Indian, dumb Indian. And I just sat there in the front seat, and I was just horrified that children could be this inhumane to one another, and got off the school bus. And since my last name was Mann, and I got a lot of attention and teaching from my grandfather who lived with us. I never knew a grandmother. I knew my great grandmother, but I didn't know either one of my grandmothers. And I burst out crying, and I had about a mile to walk down the railroad tracks. And my grandfather would sometimes come to meet me at the bus. Not every day, but usually. And I was crying. I saw him coming. I started crying aloud, and he started running to me. I ran to him. And so I told him what had happened at school. And I felt it was so unfair, because it was only Indian children that had been pulled out of class, non-Indian children, and they were probably the carriers. And so we got home, and he, after dinner, sat me down and talked to me, and said, unfortunately, there are those behaviors in this world that you're going to grow up into, and I can't keep them from happening, he said. And I had told him, why didn't they call any other of the Anglo children out? And he says, I don't know why they didn't. He said, but this is something that you are just going to have to learn to live with, because it's there. It's the way of the world in which we live. He said, but maybe you could do something about it when you grow up. And at that moment, I decided I was going to become a teacher. And I told him that, and he thought it was just great. And from that moment on, I was encouraged, and that's what I eventually ended up doing when I came to Southwestern. And students have, and I'm glad that they do have the kind of financial support and the kind of personal support that they do have. And it's exactly those things that, as the director of Native American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Montana, Harvard University Graduate School of Education, Haskell Indian Nations University, Montana State University. My entire professional career has been in Native American Studies, and it's for the very specific reason of helping Indian students get through the system to be, for their culture, their heritage, their language, for them to be recognized and respected for who they are. And so that has been my entire academic career at major institutions from one coast to the other in Native American Studies, but it was primarily to teach, for the reason of teaching Indian students, and then to create, in a way, some bonds of understanding between the first peoples of this land and those that came to settle here. So I've seen, as my grandmother said, who was at Sand Creek and who was at the Washita and saw 2 massacres. I like the way she characterizes things. She said, I have seen harsh and good times. And she went on to say, but the only thing that is hard is death. This was her death son. And like her, I've seen very harsh times. I've had very harsh experiences, but I've had a lot of good ones as well. And it is those students who that I taught for nearly 4 decades who give me a reason for living, who have made my life so purposeful, and who have made me a wealthy woman, not in terms of dollars, but wealth in terms of what they have done with their lives. And so I, in a way, although my grandfather never extracted a promise, but the promise I made to myself and to him that day that I suffered my first severe case of discrimination is something that has guided me, and uh, has been my entire reason for being involved in education.
And I want to talk about some of those teaching highlight moments too. But I just wanted to kind of see if, so you're at the undergraduate level, you want to be a teacher.
Yeah,
and then you're going
in
on
grade
to,
school.
and then you're going on to grad school, right? You're not getting any really counseling or advising from people. You just know what your track is. And I know that grad school was kind of difficult to get into for women and people of color, American Indians, anybody from a minority group. So did you have to battle a little bit to get into grad school or to get taken seriously when you were there?
Did I have to battle to get into school? I received a scholarship from a teachers organization when I graduated from high school, and it was good at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, and of course it was close to home, and so I elected to come to Weatherford from Hammond because of its proximity to my little hometown, and it was small and it was affordable. So I came to school here. So there wasn't really any problem with my being accepted into college and university for my bachelor's degree, and I completed here at Southwestern in 1954 in 3 years' time by going summers, and so then my graduate school years sort of came about as a result of my late husband, Alfred Whiteman Jr., working in the Office of Public Information at Oklahoma State University. And I was a secretary in the art department, and I decided, well, maybe I need to think of going on to grad school. And so I went part time since I was an employee. So there was never really any difficulty there, even with my undergraduate years. But when it came to grad school, that became a different issue. I was older. I don't know what colleges and universities were looking for, and I intended to major in Native American studies, and there were no universities that had that program. I knew that the University of Minnesota had a very good uh, PhD program, and I decided that, well, I'll apply there. And I never heard from them. And then I applied to the University of Oklahoma, and they responded and they said, we do not have the kind of program that you are wishing to pursue. And and besides, you have to take a graduate record exam. And those GREs had just come into existence about then, and I'm horrified. I'm not a good test taker, I'm a good test giver. And I thought, oh my goodness. And so I thought, well, no. And so the University of Oklahoma said, sorry, Minnesota eventually said sorry because I didn't have hadn't set for the graduate record exam. But I had also applied at the University of New Mexico, and uh, I must have sort of focused my application in the right direction. And they called me and they accepted me, and they said, because you have 2 degrees in English and because you have a good background in literature, I don't know if that was the case, but this is what they told me. We are very, very happy to accept you into our American Studies program, PhD program at the University of New Mexico. And I had always wanted to go to that place. Whenever I went out with the dance troupe to Gallup, New Mexico, to dance in the intertribal ceremonials, or on to Flagstaff for the 4th of July celebrations there, I was quite an Indian dancer.
Okay.
You couldn't tell now.
Yeah.
And so UNM was, and Albuquerque was a place I had already always looked at as, I would like to live here. Maybe I could go to school here. And when I applied, and they waived my need for a graduate record exam, they said, you started, we will transfer your courses from Oklahoma State University in English. I got my degree in English at OSU, and you will not have to sit for the graduate record exam. And I mean, they were administratively, from that point of view, very they made me feel like they wanted me to come to school there. And so I was already teaching. I had already gone through my Berkeley phase of teaching during the activist days and had moved to the University of Montana. And my dean gave me 3 years to come to work on my PhD, only 3 years. And he said, I'm delighted that you want to go, but you really don't need it. You're already tenured. And by that time I was as an associate professor. And he said, you'll never get much more of a salary, even if you get your PhD. But I'm delighted. And I said, well, this is something that I have to do. I cannot continue to work in Native American studies and not have the kind of credentials that places of this type expect. And he said, okay, I'll give you 3 years to go and get your doctorate degree. 3 years, I thought, okay, I've been academically disciplined. I can do it. Oh my gosh.
Goodness.
And so I moved my family down to Albuquerque. My late husband was alive. By that time, his kidneys had been affected and he was on a dialysis machine. So we moved him down to Albuquerque, and he got his medical care out of the Veterans Administration Hospital there at UNM, and off we went. My children being dragged from one university to another, it seemed like. And my oldest daughter, who's my middle child, said, you hear of Army brats. She said, you hear of BIA brats. Well, we were neither of them, but if we're anything, we are university brats. The way our mother dragged us from one campus to another. So UNM. And 3 years, and 1 year I completed my coursework. The second year I did research on my dissertation. I was ready for, well, let me see, what was it? Okay. I went down in 1978. My husband passed away on December 5th of 1980. And I had some choices to make. Do I go back to my position at the University of Montana, or do I stay here because this is where, and by that time I was ABD, and the all but dissertation stage was the point where many Indians, graduate students, washed out. And I was right at that point, and it was a big decision for me that I had to make for myself and for my children, because my late husband passed away the day that I was notified at 9:00 in the morning that I had passed my oral comprehensive exams and my written comprehensives. And by 5:00 that evening, I was a widow. And so I said, I've got the responsibility of my children. I've got this responsibility to my education. And if I'm going to have to take care of my children alone for the rest of my life, I had better be educated. And so I made the decision to stay. And I stayed in school. And so I finished in 3 years.
That's astonishing. Nobody does that.
No, with my dissertation, even it was done. But it's just one of those, I guess, that teachings. If you start something, you better finish it, and you're not to be slow about it. You get through, and it took a lot of discipline for me, and I wondered many a time whether or not I could make it, and just there was always the phone handy where I could pick up the phone and call my dean at the University of Montana and say, I'm coming back. But I knew then if I did that, I'd never get my dissertation complete. And I completed it. And I got my Doctor of Philosophy degree in American Studies with studies of Native Americans from the standpoint of educational foundations, anthropology, and the late Alfonso Ortiz was on my committee and one of my professors. And let me see, anthropology and history, I thought. And so Dr. Richard Ellis was the chair of my dissertation committee, and he's a historian. I don't know what my PhD career would have looked like without him, my dissertation. He was always there. I had a very good committee. The one that pushed me the hardest, however, was Dr. Ortiz. He pushed hard. And the day that I defended my dissertation, he could not have been more complimentary and nicer. And there were many days when I thought, what gives with this Pueblo man? I mean, what have I done to him? But he was a very good man. I think he trusted me in the regard that if he had to go on trips, I stepped in to lecture to his classes.
Oh, that's great.
So I think, I don't know that I can say that admission into school was all that difficult, but it was not an easy task to go through college with a family and to grad school and then on to doing post-grad work. Right. But it all got done.
So how about some highlights from your UC Berkeley teaching?
It was when I was at Oklahoma State University and completed my requirements for my Master of Arts degree in English, that someone from the career office called me, or job placement office, said, I think we found a job for you. And my husband was employed there. We couldn't go anyplace. And I said, what have you found? And they said, look at this. And there was this advertisement for professors in Native American Studies. And this one was at San Francisco State University. And I thought, I really want to teach Indian students, but I will never, ever go to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. My own, maybe, just my personal inclinations. And of course, it was teaching, and here I can teach Indian students, and I can teach about Indian culture, and I've just been on the tribal council. Of course, I got the background to teach in Native American studies, and I just had completed my master's degree, but I hadn't walked yet. I think that was in early January, February. Early January. Well, I applied at San Francisco State University and called, and this very nice man answered the phone, and he says, we're not hiring right now. And I said, you're not? I said, what is your name? He said, Richard Oakes. I said, Richard Oakes. He said, actually, I'm out on Alcatraz. I just came in today to do some work. And I didn't know
Great
Richard
story.
Oakes, but now I know who he was. And so he said, we're not hiring, but I do know the University of California is. And why don't you apply there? And I did. And the coordinator of that program was Lehman Brightman. So I did. I applied, was hired, and I was expected to report to work in March.
Oh my
And
goodness.
this was January, February, March. I think it was March. Yeah, February. And so everything went into a fast track. And I went to Berkeley, walked into my first classroom, no Indian students. Well, of course, I knew about the occupation of Alcatraz. And all of a sudden, the light bulb comes on, and I ask, are our Indian students out there? Well, yes, they're out there for UC Berkeley. It was a time of the Poor People's Marches, Black Power, of course, Red Power too, activism. And I, I walked on campus my first day, and I looked at beautiful buildings, and they were all, the windows, most of them were boarded up. And I thought, why is this boarded up? The university is in session. Well, I learned very quickly when the first protest occurred on the UC Berkeley campus, and I was walking back from lunch with a friend, and we were somehow got wedged in between the people who constituted the Poor People's March and the riot police, who were standing there with their bulletproof shields. I mean, and with their tear gas and to disperse the crowd. And caught between two opposing forces. And my office was in Dwinell Hall, and it was just right away. And this friend said, come on, let's go. And there I used to wear stilettos, high heels in that day. I discovered I could run in them. I even jumped over a burning garbage can, and without burning myself, got to my office in Dwinell Hall, and I thought, this is Berkeley. This is UC Berkeley, and I am here as a lecturer in Native American Studies. And it was among the earliest Native American Studies programs in the entire country. Native American Studies programs really got their start on the West Coast, and UC Berkeley was among the earliest. And so I discovered that. That's why I don't have Indian students in my class. They're out on Alcatraz. They began coming back, and with their sense of activism and their search for freedom and their desire to counter all of this oppression historically, culturally, that we have endured. They were in my class. Those were some very interesting classes and discussion. I mean, I came out of Western Oklahoma where we're so, I guess, just in comparison, where we're so conservative compared to what they were in the 1970s.
Right.
And I quickly took on the rhetoric. I became an activist. And my students and I one day went and protested the movie A Man Called Horse.
Yes.
And we walked for one whole day. I had my braids. My late husband had made me some clothes that had fringes. I mean, I was Miss Activist of that time. And so I wore a callus in the bottom of my foot. And I left there. I finally thought, I looked at my children and I thought, this is where I really want to rear them, is that this this where they are going to be the safest, that they're going to get a good education, which they did in the school system. But, and of course, I was removing them from the activist environment, but I was the biggest activist. I was an activist myself. Yeah, so I didn't, the activism went with them, and I applied for a job, 2 jobs at the University of Montana in Missoula and Western Washington University at Bellingham. And I was interviewed for both of them and was offered a job at both of them. And so it was quite a dilemma as to where I wanted to be. And I love the ocean. I love the water. I would have loved to have had environmentally, I guess, in relation to the water, like to have taught there. And many years later, when Vine Deloria went to teach there, I said, oh my gosh, I missed the opportunity to teach with this giant in American Indian history, religion, and philosophy. But I chose the University of Montana, the mountains, the place. It was so different from the environment at UC Berkeley. I thought, my children will thrive here. This is a good home for them. And so I became the director of Native American Studies at the University of Montana in August of 1972.
And Northern Cheyenne relatives up there.
Right, there were. That was another draw, and I thought, this is so quiet compared to the chaos of the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was true, and I have relatives on the Northern Cheyenne, the Suktis family. Charlie Suktis is my father's first cousin, therefore my father too. And so we arrived there, and my first semester there, the Trail of Broken Treaties originated on the West Coast. And one of the trails came through Missoula, Montana, and the person in charge was none other than Russell Means. And so they got in touch with the students, wanted a place to sleep, wanted a place to eat. And so the Giayo Indian Club was very active then and was made up of a lot of the veterans who had just come back from, what was it, Vietnam? Mm-hmm. Jack Plumage was the president of the Giayo Indian Club. When Giayo, and I'm not saying it correctly, is a Blackfeet word for grizzly bear. So they were the grizzly bears, and the University of Montana's are the grizzlies. And so they came through town. They were coming through town. There were plenty places for lodging, for feeding, and so forth. And it was a weekend. And I missed my activist days from Berkeley, actually. And so I decided, well, I'm going to have to go and check on the students, to see how they're doing. And I think it was a Sunday afternoon by then. So I went to campus, and there was Russell Means speaking on a megaphone on the bullhorn on the oval of the campus of the University of Montana in front of this great big old grizzly statue. And I got there in time to say, come with us and we'll get you credit. And I thought, how are they going to do that? Who have they been talking to? And I stood there, and I finally went up, and there was a break, and I introduced myself, and he said, well, we need to visit with you. And I said, well, let's go back to Native American Studies. And the club offices were downstairs, and he insisted the invitation was there. And then he looked at me, and he said, don't tell me that you're an anti-tomahawk. And I looked at him and I said, oh, I can't be. I just came from Berkeley. I support yes, I supported you're coming to our student campus, and we helped organize. I was somewhat responsible for that. Our students were, but yes, we thought we could be good hosts. But now you want to take my students with you. Mm. Well, well, we'll see. And I called my dean, and in a little bit he came bounding down the stairs, and he was, uh, I had a wonderful dean, and it was a weekend. And for some reason or another, as he was coming down the stairs, I noticed first of all these Levi's that had red and white stripes on them and stars. I don't know if he dressed for the occasion or what. And we sat and we negotiated, and he called in a professor from humanities and a professor from sociology and myself. And we went off into the room and we decided, yes, some of our students could go. And we would give them what we call 15 hours of omnibus credit, which is sort of like independent study. And so we went back, and they said, but they have to furnish their own transportation. And Dean Solberg was his name, Richard Solberg, said, well, we can't let them go in university vehicles with the United States flag flying on the fender, or I mean, painted on the fender. And so they said, maybe we can rent cars. And I said, try, but I doubt it once you tell them you're going on the trails of broken treaties. And no one had an automobile that they could trust, and there were 15 students, and some of whom had children, who signed up for the course, enrolled in independent study. And in 3 days' time, while that leg of the Trails of Broken Treaties was there, they managed to raise enough money to buy 3 reservation type cars.
Oh my gosh.
3 cars, 15 students, some family members. And they said, we need bullhorns, we need all of this. I mean, Russell Means sat out his I need list. And so we donated a few things, and off they went. They went on the Trails of Broken Treaties. Oh my gosh. And then they stayed, and next thing I know, they were occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. And I was worried when television would show that, again, the riot police were there. They're ready to take them out, and my students are in that building. And I tell my late husband, I really have to go to Washington, D.C. I have to go. And he looked at me and said, what are you going to do when you get there? He said, I don't know if they'll let you in the building. I don't even know that they'll let you around the building. It's surrounded by now. And so they came home. 14 of them came back, and one of them didn't because he lived in Wisconsin. And when the cars came back across the United States from D.C. to Missoula, Montana, he just decided to get off in Wisconsin and go home. Enough. This was enough for him. I don't know if he ever went back to school. But 14 came back, and one of our requirements was you will keep a journal. One part will be what happened today, and the other part is going to be how I felt about it. They were phenomenal journals. And we had a celebration for their return. And John Whittlakes, who was then chairman of the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council, came over, welcomed them. And he said, we as Cheyennes always send our scouts out to look over what's out there. He said, and he said, we were aware of Custer when he and his troops were around. He said, and he said, and I understand that before Custer left Washington, D.C., he told the president, don't do anything about the Indian problem until I come back. Well, you know what happened in 1876 at the Little Bighorn, he said. And so I look at you young people as scouts, but there is one thing that you should have told the government. You should have told them, Custer won't be back. So now do something about the Indian problem. So their book, they were going to do a book. Unfortunately, we negotiated a contract, and it said that the publishers would not be liable for any lawsuits or anything that came of this. And I thought, I don't see how I would put my students in the position of being liable for something such as this, although their participation was an educational exercise. And so we never did publish the book, but it was going to be Tell Them Custer Won't Be Back. Their materials, their journals are now in the archives or remain in the archives of the University Library at the University of Montana in Missoula. They're there. They're available for someone to study. A big highlight. That was my first semester there, and I dare say it could have been my last in terms of how people were pursuing activism and what we were. I mean, the wake up call that we were engaged in. It just so happened I had a wonderful dean, wonderful administration, and it worked out for the students. And the 15 hours that they got in reading, and there were the three professors who helped grade them. It wasn't just me, that was the three. And they each got 15 credit hours of A's. I'm sure it helped some of them graduate at the end, or certainly put them on the dean's honor roll or whatnot. But that is something I guess I look back over my time. I was quite a different kind of professor, I guess. But in Native American studies, you have to be who you are. And part of it was learning to live in this world that the students were walking into.
Yes, and to be able to validate those transformative experiences and have colleagues working with you to let that happen. That's neat. Well, you yourself have written some books, and I don't know if you might want to talk about. You published a book on Cheyenne Arapaho education, which I thought was really neat, 1871 to 1982. I was wondering what led you to want to write that book. And
very simple, very easy. It's a copy of my dissertation.
Okay.
And
that was because I didn't get to
ask you
what your dissertation was about.
I stopped at 1982. That was when I got my doctorate degree.
Right.
So I studied the tribe's history in education from the days at Darlington, which was then our headquarters, to the time I graduated. My book did not get published till I think 15 years later. I absolutely refused to look at it. Once I got my dissertation done, no. And the University of New Mexico Press was interested in publishing it since I had graduated there, but they wanted me to make so many changes. And I said, no, I'm not going to make any changes. I'm not ready to do that now. And then the University of Colorado gave me an award for the best manuscript in the humanities in the mid-1990s, I think it was. And then they ultimately published. A part of the award was a monetary award to publish my book. And I did consent to make a few changes for them. They had someone do
After all, you did it in just record time.
I thought, well, I could have done a little bit more. And it was told from the book actually is in two parts. Culturally historical, talked about pre-contact education, but looking at life through the lens of my great-grandmother, White Buffalo woman. And hers was such a rich life. And then I come into existence. I was born in 1934. Let me see, the Johnson-O'Malley Act was enacted into law in April, I think, of 1934. The Indian Reorganization Act was enacted in June of 1934, and I was born right in the intervening month in May of 1934. And so from that point on, then I look at education through my eyes, and I always consider that to be the weaker part of my dissertation. It's sort of, through the eyes of two Cheyenne women, looking at education. And Cho Bruchek later, recently, well, not too many years ago, told me, he says, I just really don't like the title of your book. It is phenomenal. Why didn't you just say Grandmother's Children? He said, because it was a dissertation. I said, that was what it was. And you don't have fancy titles whenever you do a dissertation, or at least mine didn't allow me. And so it was published and went through one printing and wasn't printed anymore. It no longer exists. Do you have a copy?
There are copies out there, I'm sure of that, because everybody is so good anymore about keeping dissertation copies. But I'm going to find out if we have one at our library.
I'll give you one of mine.
Because we should have one at OSU, especially because of your OSU connection.
And so, no, and I don't know, I'm sure there are other highlights. I left the University of Montana several times on what I call my personal sabbatical. In 1986, I became the first Indian woman to ever direct the Office of Indian Education Programs for the BIA that I said I'd never worked for. And then they gave me leave to go to teach at Harvard in the American Indian program. They gave me leave to go and work on sacred sites. These were my own internal sabbaticals for the sacred site work was 2 years.
Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Although I was at the University of Montana, if you look from 1972 to 2000, that's 28 years, but I was there most of the time, but intermittently I went off to do other things. I went off in 77, I think it was, to direct the American Indian program, and to be a lecturer in the School of Education of Harvard University. So that took a year off. And then I went to work on Indian sacred sites because of amendments that some certain Indian organizations wanted to have enacted into law to amend the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. And they had 4 broad categories: the use of peyote, Indian sacred sites, rights of Indian prisoners, and the use of eagle feathers and other animal parts. And they thought that those would be 4 amendments that needed to be enacted to, I'll call it ARFA. But none of them ever got enacted, and I walked the halls of Congress for 2 years trying to get support for our amendments to ARFA. The only one that has subsequently got enacted into law was the peyote portion of it, and I'm glad that happened. I can remember that Reuben Snake, who was a peyote road man, and was in charge of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act project. And his attorney, who was James Botsford, we called him Botsy. They would say, just take that peyote section out and you go with the other 3, because at that time the churches had declared their war on drugs. And Reuben and his attorney had thought that they were holding up passage of our legislation. But ironically, when you look back upon those 4 proposed amendments to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and first of all, I think we're absolutely ludicrous that the United States of America does not extend us as this country's indigenous population's First Amendment protection. And it took that special piece of legislation to do that, and still is in need of amendments, because we are still fighting the battle of Indian sacred sites. And 75% of Indian sacred sites are on federal land. So how far are we going to get to save that? And now we're fighting that whole issue of development in the Arctic wildlife refuge, ANWR. And of course, the President of the United States has said you can go in and develop. And so it was that kind of a battle that I was fighting. I was the national coordinator for the American Indian Religious Freedom Act Coalition. and extremely, extremely important work, critical work that we never got done. And I had to get back to the University of Montana to go back to my classroom. Uh, then I took a leave of absence to I had taken a leave of absence to go and be the director of the Office of Indian Education Programs, and really felt I had to redeem my reputation. That was when I went to work on sacred sites. And after that, I took another personal sabbatical to teach at Haskell Indian Nations University, and quickly was moved from my visiting professor status to become interim dean of education. And the students there had an issue that they were fighting in terms of the wetlands, and Kansas wanting to route its road around Lawrence. And the students were saying, no, you're not going to go through our wetlands, because wetlands was where in the early days of Haskell that they believed that those administrators had buried the Indian children. And wetlands in general are just, vital to the environment. But I understand that has gone through. And let me see, where else did I run off to? Then my 3-year leave from the university to get my doctorate degree. So the University of Montana was very good to me in saying, go off and do that work. They thought it was very good for me to have such a high level position in 1986 as director of the Office of Indian Education Programs, and I was a deputy to the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. And so the university really, I think, liked the idea that I was, as I have been told, the highest ranking Indian women in Indian education in the Reagan administration. I don't know if I should say that too loudly or not, but that was the way it was. So I have had a very blessed life.
Well, I want to ask you about, because you worked on a movie too. You did cultural consulting for Last of the Dogmen. Can you talk about that experience a little?
Oh, gosh. The writer. Well, I don't know who. Oh, I think I know who recommended me. I heard, I don't know if I've ever really confirmed that. I think that the request came to the National Museum of the American Indian in its very, very early stages before it was ever built on the National Mall. But I think Rick West was sort of recommended me. So I hear, I don't know if he did or didn't. So, but I credit Rick for recommending me to help with the cultural background material for Last of the Dogmen. And so the young man that wrote the script, and I agreed. And I said, I will do that only if you will make sure that I clear this much money and you pay my taxes. And they said, okay, we want you, we'll pay your taxes, and you will have all that what we said we'd give you free. So I read their script, and the young man, blatant use of 4-letter words. Oh my gosh. And just like I do for my students, I had my red pen and I was marking up his paperwork with remove this 4-letter word. And it was just, so he said he was a little bit taken aback when he got my script, and he looked and he saw all of those X's in the script with delete this word. You don't need to have this 4-letter word here. You have a better command of the English language, so you do not need to resort to this. And he said, I only intended that you read the parts that were related to Cheyennes more so. And I said, well, I couldn't do that. I said, you send me the script. And so I did. He said, you just cannot sanitize this as much as you want it to. The world of Hollywood is different than real life. And so then I became the personal Cheyenne language coach for Barbara Hershey. My younger brother became the Cheyenne language coach for, who was the man?
forgotten.
Oh, I know him. I know him too. I can see him. Anyway, and for Steve Rivas, both. He was the male language coach. Right. And so I got to meet Barbara Hershey and work with her, and it was a frustrating experience, I dare say, for the both of us. And finally, I recorded her words on a little tape cassette. And she would put that tape player under her pillow, and she subliminally, I guess, it helped her to learn the words. And the late Mr. Black Bear, the old man Black Bear, played in the movie.
Right.
And we could not get him to stay on script. And so
sort of
we
like
would have to
George.
Yeah, I think so. Because, and I'd say, and listen to him speak, okay, Barbara, here's where you start speaking when he says this word. Well, the word that was her code. Was he put it in a different place, and she began interrupting him. And I just said, well, I didn't go on location down to Cuernavaca, Mexico with the group. I had to stay in my classroom then. But I would go down there to visit with him periodically. And it was Eugene Black Bear Sr. And so we got down there, and he's related to my mother, and we were having a meeting before they went out to on location the next day. And my son, Alfred Alden Whiteman Jr. No junior. He's a third. If there's anything on this, was an extra. And so we were having a meeting, and one of the volcanoes around in Mexico was getting more and more active. And they said there wasn't that much cloud. There wasn't much of a cloud, but now look at it, and you can feel it every once in a while. So we sat and had a prayer about with them being there, and it wasn't all that far. And we know about what happened in Italy, and I thought if the Cheyennes are going to be here, that volcano cannot erupt, because a lot of them are here because of me. And my younger brother was there on location to help, and so we prayed, we ate together, and slept. And the next morning, this is one of the times I was going on location. I went on location, and then Mr. Black Bear looked at me. He said, "Niece," and I said, "Yes." He said, "You be careful tomorrow when we go out on relocation." He said, "Because there's rattlesnakes out there." That was the word that can get me so worked up. I've never been a friend to snakes, and I think they've been friends to me. I've been across a few rattlesnakes that haven't come after me, and I was hyper sitting out there in the chair working with Barbara. If something brushed my foot, or I heard something, that was the exciting portion of it. And then they finished it and moved into Canada. I don't know what happened with the people that were financing the education, but they never called us back together. And they changed the ending. And I do not even know if Tom Berenger, that's his name, Tom Berenger, right, played in the re-edited or the edited ending to it. This is the ending. Well, they wanted to indicate that they were in civilization, and they wanted the cars, to be seen running down on one of the highways close to where they were hiding out. But anyway, it ended that way, sort of in. There's nothing I can say about it. I'm not engaged in this portion anymore. It's done. But I think, and then the credits come, and once and they continue to film some work they do some filming in Los Angeles, and I couldn't go. And so in the credits, there's an all-runner that was listed as Cheyenne language coach, and I was moved to help him with the script. So that's okay. That's all right. I don't ever want to say those weren't the right words, Henry. So movies, and so I've done a few other documentaries. Probably the one that is most widely circulated is In the White Man's Image, which was produced by PBS American Experience, and talks about Indian boarding schools. So, there have been others. How the West Was Lost.
As consultant.
Yeah. And Pahasapa, Struggle for the Black Hills. So I have done a only movie, Last of the Dogmen, but I have been involved in several documentaries.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap up here pretty soon, but I wonder if for a while you were Cheyenne Arapaho tribe decided to start a college in collaboration, I guess, with Southwestern, or it was housed there. And I wonder, and you were president. So I wonder if you can talk about how that came about and just tell us a bit about it.
Well, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes created an educational authority, and there were several members on the board, and I was one of them, which goes back to maybe 2003. And we worked on goals in tribal education. And one of them involved a tribal college. And of course, by this time, tribal colleges are beginning to proliferate in other parts of the country, of which there are now, last count, 40 such tribal colleges in the country, most of them along the northern tier. And so a tribal college. We're going to have a tribal college. And so in 2000, and I served on the educational authority, and I came down from Montana to one meeting and went back home. And then my daughter writes me and she says, are you moving from Montana? And I said, no, why? She said, well, I just saw an article on you that said you had become the president of the tribal college, and I just assumed you were going to move back to Oklahoma. I said, no. Well, apparently they were supposed to. Someone forgot to talk to me about that, and they and the press release had already gone up. And so I said, I can't. I'm working, and so we decided the best temporary measure was for me to become interim president, which I did in 2006. And I tried to build a tribal college from Montana, and you just don't do that. And by that time, I was special assistant to the president of Montana State University, the first president. And so he said, well, you go down and help them. So I came down here the last day in December in 2008, became the president of the tribal college here on the campus of Southwestern Oklahoma State University. So I served as interim president for 2 years and came down here in 2008, and the tribal college closed down because of a lack of funding from the tribes. They had funded all of it, a total funding amount of $3 million, which is really nothing compared to what it takes to build a tribal college. And we were very close to submitting our paperwork to become a tribal college, which would then following that go for accreditation. And we were working on all of that. And the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes, that particular administration said, enough, we have other priorities, said that's it. But Quentin Romanos was the one that was largely responsible for coordinating between the tribes and Southwestern Oklahoma State University to have the tribal college here on the campus of Southwestern. So it was a very wonderful dream, a very necessary dream, but sometimes dreams go by the wayside because of politics and funding.
Right.
So I don't know what more
Or
I can
seeds
say
get
about it.
planted and maybe they grow much later.
Yeah.
But,
And maybe someday there will be another college. The paperwork is all there. On the library at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. Maybe someone will go into the archives and get the paperwork and dust off all the work that we did in the, I guess, I came down in 2008 and the tribal college closed in June of 2015. So there's a lot of work that's in the archives at Southwestern. I was not a happy camper.
Yes.
And I did not want to come down in the first place, but I was begged to come down. And being an educator has been one of a life of service. And I thought and again, I'm saying I have educated young people all over the United States, but it is time for me to go home to help educate my own. It is time to build them their own place of learning that's going to be built upon Cheyenne and Arapaho culture and history, values, philosophy, all of that. And that was my personal commitment to the tribal college, along with the administrative experience that I had. I have 19 years as a department head of Native American Studies or administration at the University of Montana, the time with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, at Harvard, at Haskell. And so I brought that experience home to the tribal college. Yes. How do I tactfully say this? I was very, very disappointed when the tribal administration decided to not give us any more funding, and we didn't. By that time, we relied solely upon the tribes, because that's the way tribal colleges began.
Right.
By tribes, and then they can go on for outside funding. And so it was essentially a long dream, and grew out of our educational authority and the need to educate our young people in public schools, and for the tribe to step in then and to have its own tribal college, its own national institution. And it did for a while.
Well, I wish it had had a happier ending, but we're all happy that you're here in Oklahoma again. And now you're getting tapped constantly for, not just on the national level, but here locally to help with, to help on boards and advise. And so you're very busy.
I am busy. But I wouldn't have it any other way. And if I have certain experience, or if there's an expertise or an area that I value, it's education, and it's American Indians.
Well, I just the name tribes have different phrases, like for this part of a woman's life, whether it's sort of a source when you're at kind of the height really of your wisdom and spiritual power. And I was wondering if there's a Cheyenne term for that, and how you feel about this part of your life.
When I turned 50, and I was living in Montana, and my father had called and to wish me happy birthday, and bought me some skis. Oh. And he said, "What do you want for your birthday?" And I said, "Well, it's just May, but I could use some skis because I love to go to cross country ski." And he says, "Oh my!" He didn't know that there was a difference between cross country and downhill. And he said, "Okay, I'll get them for you. How much are they going to cost?" He said, "But I don't want you to be hollering for daddy as you come down that slope. And I laughed and I said, no, you know me. I said, you always said you're a man. You act very brave and courageous. And so we talked about one's age at that point. And he said, you could just stop doing anything you wanted to now. He said, because as we put it, we say, Niho heyo. And I have not heard that in very common usage. And so I said, okay, I think I know what it means, but I'm not very sure. He said, well, my grandma used to talk about that, about when you come into your own. And for us, it's supposed to be 50. And then after that, you go into retirement. He said, it is like a flag's being planted at the top of a high hill. And you're ready to go down the other side, and you can just slide down that. He recognized that in me at age 50, but I think it really came much later. Maybe I was a slow learner, or maybe I've had two times where that flag has been planted at a very high point in my life. I don't know that I have gone down the other side yet. I think that flag is still up there from a cultural frame of reference, that it's there. And my great grandmother, who lived to be 85, and lived a life of service as a midwife and as a healer of horses, and horses are so important. They were important to us, but how tragic it must have been for her to have been among those that went into Darlington, our tribal headquarters, to make that break with the horse and with the buffalo. But she is my role model. But she continued, she reared two grandchildren when their mother passed away, my father and his older sister, Miriam, twins. And she and I spent 4 years together, and I was born. Mm. And the photograph that you see there, I am in that cradle board.
Oh.
And she blessed me in a baby blessing ceremony, as my father described it. I do not know what she prayed for. I do not know what my life is supposed to be, but I think it is that I live a life of service, that I live a life that is respectful and loving of the people to whom I belong, as one of their Sundance women, one of their prayer women, a ceremonial woman. So my reason for being are just not children. My reason for existence is for the Cheyenne people.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Mann.
You're welcome.